first four of these are not particularly controversial. Most of the debate over the justice of certain military interventions has to do with both the cause and the intention. And the idea of the just cause is either self-defense or preemptive or preventing or preventing or stopping injustice from being done. Now, that's where those extensions of the just war idea come in. Right? And I admit, these are particularly difficult to get at in most modern day military incursions. Remember, when the just war theory was quote canonized, this was really easy to tell what self-defense meant. There really was no such, preemptive strikes were not necessary. And self-defense came into play when your borders had been crossed. And maintaining the distinction between combatants and non-combatants was really easy because combatants wore bright-colored uniforms and stood in a row and shot at each other, which sounds insane to me, but that's the way it was done. Right? Women and children stayed at home.
Or watched.
In some cases. Today, that's a lot trickier to get at. Okay? The proper authority essentially extends to legitimately recognized governments as opposed to community-constituted militias, or I suppose in a place like Afghanistan, the tribal militias could be seen as as a proper authority, given that they're large swaths of Afghanistan, for example, that are beyond the reach of the central government. The idea that it is a last resort, after all other options have been exhausted, I'd say all of these criteria are essentially appealed to today when people assess going to war. The trickier ones, I think, are these here, because proportionate means and limited objectives seem to me on the surface to rule out Hiroshima and Nagasaki, as would be the case with non-combatant immunity, would rule out most forms of terrorism. It would rule out the firebombing of cities that took place in World War II. And unless you had something like, targeted or tactical nuclear weapons, it's a lot more complicated to ensure immunity. Now, what this has come to mean is that you don't intentionally target civilians. And there are some countries, some groups that are aware of this part of the just war tradition that's adhered to by their enemies. And so as a result, we saw this in Vietnam too, where soldiers would be embedded in civilian neighborhoods, weapons would be embedded, and the families often where these weapons are embedded are not given a choice. And so, maybe that families scattered throughout the city may have all sorts of weapons caches in their homes because they've essentially been forced to do that. And so, as a result, adhering to this often puts your own troops at significantly higher risk because the Israelis, for example, and granted, in some instances they just flatten entire neighborhoods, but in other cases, to ensure non-combatant immunity as best they can, they go house to house instead of just bombing neighborhoods. So there's ensuring that the difference between collateral damage and targeting non-combatants is a little bit tricky, I think, to keep separate sometimes. So it's these areas, not so much this, but these last two that cause critics of the just war tradition to suggest that those are simply out of date. They were formulated during a period when war was waged totally differently than it is today. And there are some who argue that we should either dramatically revise these or eliminate them altogether. And just suggest that the objectives be limited to repelling the threat, not destroying your enemy. Okay. Now, think about how you would reformulate those parts of the just war tradition to bring them a little bit more up to date. And this it seems to me, this is one of the really hard questions for the just war advocate, is to live with these criteria consistently the way war is waged today. It is, in my view, a really significant challenge. And for this, in some conflicts in some parts of the world, this comes down strictly to intent. And measuring and assessing that is, you sort of throw up your hands with that.
I'm just listening to the limited objectives piece and thinking of how hard it has been for me to harmonize the God of the Old Testament and the God of the New Testament kind of thing. He's described as a Lord of armies, a man of war, and he tells Israel to utterly wipe out the limited objective idea, leave no person standing.
One time. No, and see, this is where, just between us here, this is why you can't use the argument that there's nothing intrinsically wrong with waging war because God commanded it. You can't use that about the death penalty either. Because in that one instance, God commanded total annihilation. That's one of the trickiest parts in all of the Scripture, in my view, to address. And we would be much better off, in my view, in being able to take a Christian ethic to the culture if that episode were not there. I don't, let's put it this way, that's too strong. I don't like having to provide an answer for that. That's a better way to put it.
So he commanded that one time?
One time.
Was that?
It was in Joshua with the Amalekites. Right, now, the traditional sort of theologically grounded response to that is that, God in most cases delays his judgment out of grace and mercy, waiting for people to come to a knowledge of the truth. But that there's nothing immoral with God executing a temporal judgment on someone. I mean, it's only by the grace of God that we're not all wiped out, right? I mean, especially true before the cross.
Well, put that in his promise to Noah. Well, that he wouldn't,
At least not by flood.
at least not by
Not by flood. Okay. So that, at the least, on the people who were of the age of accountability, there's nothing immoral or improper about God choosing to exercise temporal judgment when he did. Right? Since that's what we all deserve. Right? The tricky part is on the children and on the animals. Right? Now, neither of those had reached any kind of age of accountability. Comment on that?
There's an argument. I think there's a good argument for the children in that if you wipe out the adults, then there's no one to raise the children. And if the children are not of an age of accountability, then it's foreseeable that they would go to be with God in any event. So I think that's,
Possibly.
That may be God providing
Yeah.
for them. And as far as the animals are concerned, animals, as much as
No, animals are not
They
agents
have
of accountability.
souls.
Right. I don't know about that for one, but that's a different question. We'll get to that later. Certainly, animals do not have eternal significance.
We can agree on that, yes.
Yeah, okay. All right. Now, I think that's sort of the standard theological understanding of it. I think there's probably something to do with the way this was viewed in the ancient world that we're missing here. I don't find the traditional theological response to this super compelling myself. And it would be, the idea that God is described in those terms as, a God of war with armies. I think those are, the military figures of speech, that's just what they are, is figurative language. But if there were something intrinsically problematic about that, then you could probably raise a question about why those figures of speech would be used, especially so commonly. But how, this, doing justice, I think, to the prerogative of God to exercise judgment when he chooses, I think takes us quite a ways in providing an answer for that. Yeah.
I feel like somehow we need to see and understand that the Lord of armies, that is, there's something loving about exercising violence, I guess. I don't know how to say that.
Well, I think there certainly can be. It is loving for my family to shoot the guy who's holding a knife at my wife's throat. No doubt. I don't think you can say there's much that's loving toward the guy who's holding the knife at her throat. However, I've heard some try to do some sort of exegetical gymnastics around that, and that's a stretch, I think. But I do think in general, we've talked about this already, the law of love is something we have to take really seriously. And when a mortal threat, it is not loving to allow a mortal threat to go unresisted to your neighbor. But how how that translates to this is that's a different question. And I mean, I think there's still wisdom in limited objectives, in proportionate means, and non-combatant immunity. And so I would not be in favor of dispensing with those. But I do think that there's some modification that would be helpful to take into account the ways that war is waged today. Now, Michael Walzer does this in one sense in his Just and Unjust Wars, where he talks about that a supreme emergency can suspend the norms, temporarily suspend the norms of a just war. So that, for example, he would say when terrorists embed weapons in civilian neighborhoods, most bets are off when it comes to non-combatant immunity. I don't know if he would say that you would be morally required to go house to house and put yourselves at greater risk. And that, should Iran launch a nuclear weapon, I think Walzer would say that's a supreme emergency. All bets are off on proportionate means or on non-combatant immunity. But that's the best way that I'm aware of for how people deal with that and still sort of preserve a just war tradition that admittedly, at least these two parts, I think those are on a little shaky ground today.
The issue of proportionate means, if you take, quote unquote, nuclear off the table because that's disproportionate, how do you draw the line when the U.S., for example, has incredible technology and people we may be at war with have very little? Do we then scale down? Do we stop using drones or
No,
how do you
that's a good question.
decide
What that
what's
refers to is that the means employed is proportionate to the level of the threat. Right? So it doesn't refer necessarily to anything technological. It's more that the overall use of force. In other words, you're not going to swat a fly with a sledgehammer. That the use of force is proportionate to the threat that's perceived. Okay. Now, of course, the Hiroshima was justified or attempted to be justified on strictly utilitarian grounds. That more lives would be lost had a conventional war been fought, particularly because surrender was so against the ethos of the Japanese. Whether or not that calculation is true or not, I think maybe is up for some debate. But there probably is some merit to the idea that only an overwhelming show of force could have forced a surrender. There probably is something to that. And that using conventional measures were not going to be sufficient to do that.
Yeah, and I mean, even after the first bomb was dropped, they didn't surrender.
That's right.
So, I mean, and it wasn't just the military, the American military that was going to suffer losses.
No, that's right.
There was going to be a huge loss of civilian life with a devastating effect on those soldiers who survived.
Yeah, no, that's right. It's all true. And it all comes into that calculation. Right? Now, strictly speaking, for the just war proponent, that calculation is irrelevant to the principle of non-combatant immunity. I'm saying for the strict just war proponent. Right? And I think to launch Hiroshima would require some justification for suspending this. And it's the utilitarian calculus that, in my view, formed the justification for suspending this principle. Right? You're certainly entitled to see that differently.
I do, thank you.
Right, fair enough. Fair enough.
Just, an interesting observation that came to mind is when we hear newscasters and reports and things, you often hear the buzzword, women and children, women and children, women and children. It seems to be, there's something, I think, that seems intrinsic in us that sees these people are off limits for.
Well, because they're unarmed and
Right.
non-combatants.
They're not so non-combatant
Sorry?
anymore. Well, and the whole purpose of all this discussion is because they're not so.
That's right.
Yeah.
That's right. And intentionally so
Yes.
in some places. And so,
It's
I think
explaining it more to
yeah.
reality.
right. And Walter's point is that, essentially when you have one side that doesn't play by those conventions, then your obligation to do so is diminished. Okay. Now, one more controversial thing to talk about here. And that is, this is case 11.3. What do you do with what some would call extreme measures, such as waterboarding, which, as you're not familiar with that, it simulates drowning without having to stuff somebody's head underwater. And I suppose you could probably extend that to other extreme measures that are used to gather information. Now, there's some argue that all use of extreme measures are off the table. Fundamentally, because it assaults the dignity of the person being interrogated and cheapens and tarnishes the interrogator to do that. So some of this, let's say the proponents of extreme measures argue that, for one, to be clear, you have to distinguish between extreme measures and torture, that those are not necessarily the same thing. It seems to me what happens at Guantanamo and what happens if you're in the custody of the Iranian Secret Service or the Saudi Secret Police or during the Cold War, if you were interrogated in the basement of the Lubyanka prison in Moscow. There are other things that I think clearly fall under the heading of torture, where you have electrodes attached to certain sensitive body parts, and where the person essentially is just slowly killed through that process. Okay? I think there's a difference between things like sleep deprivation, some what I would call sort of mild physical abuse, temperature, extreme changes in temperature, and I think even this is my own view of this. I don't think I would put waterboarding in the same category with the kinds of things that take place in the basement of Lubyanka, for example. part of the reason for that is that there are thousands of military personnel who are subjected to waterboarding as a part of their training. And when this first came out, if you'll recall, there were a number of journalists who actually volunteered to be subjected to waterboarding. I think that's in a different category, it seems to me, than what takes place in the bowels of the Iranian Secret Service. Nobody signs up to see if that constitutes torture. I mean, at least nobody in their right mind volunteers for that. Right? So, for one, I think we need to be clear about the difference between what I would refer to as extreme measures as opposed to torture. I don't think those are necessarily the same thing. Right? Now, the use of extreme measures, I think, is justifiable to get information. The real questions are over here. I don't mean to be over here with you guys. You're the torture chamber over here. But the use of things that we would obviously call torture in order to get information. I think as a general rule, those ought to be off the table because I do think they're an assault on the dignity of the interrogator, and I do think they demean the person doing the interrogation. However, if the one hypothetical that everybody gives, if there's a nuclear bomb that's been planted and scheduled to go off under the White House or under Congress or in some well-populated area, and so-and-so sitting right here knows the location of the bomb, then I think that utilitarian calculus is acceptable. And I think the obligation then, the overriding obligation is to save the hundreds of thousands of people's lives that may be at stake. But I think it strikes me a little unusual that it takes hypothetical situations to justify that. And I think what that suggests is that the things that would justify that would be very, very rare, if at all. But I think there's probably room to leave that open in terms of principle, right? And the grief I'm going to get for that begins now.
I mean, like how far are you justifying going? I mean, anything that anything goes in terms of getting that information out of that guy?
No, you do as
little as you can.
well, yeah, it would still be sort of proportionate means. And let me leave it at that.
That's kind of the cool thing about waterboarding is it doesn't do any permanent damage.
I don't know if I call that a cool thing.
It scares them, but it convinces the person that they're going to die unless they provide the information. And by the means of that, we have received information that has saved, outside of a hypothetical, we've received information that has saved thousands and thousands of people's lives by the use of something such as waterboarding.
Yeah.
And I believe all of this, I believe anybody who goes through SEAL training has been through waterboarding.
Oh, yeah. All, to my knowledge, all special forces.
Yeah.
And it's a bigger group than that. I'm not sure all who's under that umbrella. But it is part of training.
Right. And it's, I mean.
Yeah, I don't think you would,
if
you
you've
don't,
body surfed-
yeah.
If you've body surfed, you've been through a lot
Well,
of
I don't know about that, but
waterboard.
I don't know about, I'd have to think a little bit about that. But, yeah,
I think a lot of men and women have bravely given their lives and, and the lives of their families to provide specifically for this country and the well-being of our country. And I think sometimes it's hard to grasp some of these measures because you haven't been put in a position
Right.
to face. You don't really understand the degree of evil there.
that's
Because
correct.
we've had a privilege of our men and women in uniform providing their lives and sacrificing their lives in order that
Right.
we may study and we may have our families intact.
No,
So
absolutely, that's right.
we are definitely arguing this point from a standpoint that we don't understand the degrees of evil presented. Whereas being, I'm thinking of World War II, where you're in a situation where you're in the city and you have a sniper, and just kind of visually going through maybe a scene.
Which is, yeah, it's a great point. And this is a bit of what Michael Walzer refers to as his supreme emergency. That there are times when all bets are off. And it is, you're right, it's one thing to study this in an academic setting in a free society. It's a different thing to think about this in some other parts of the world. And I don't want to do the Jack Nicholson thing of you can't handle the truth as a justification for anything. But I think again distinguishing between extreme measures and what clearly constitutes torture is really important. And this is off the table, of course, except in the most extreme mostly hypothetical situations. This, the extreme measures, I would not put that under the heading of torture myself.
Biola University offers a variety of biblically centered degree programs, ranging from business to ministry to the arts and sciences. Visit biola.edu to find out how Biola could make a difference in your life.